The year was 1305, and the streets of London resonated with the shouts of merchants selling their goods, along with the sound of horses' hooves striking the cobblestones. However, on this solemn morning, a different noise would soon dominate the atmosphere. The uproar of a bloodthirsty crowd assembling to witness one of the most infamous executions in history. The man destined to face death was William Wallace, a Scottish knight who had boldly stood against the English monarchy and rallied his fellow countrymen to resist foreign domination. What unfolded at that moment was far more than a mere execution. It was a meticulously planned spectacle of cruelty, intended not only to end a life, but to obliterate the man and everything he symbolized. Popular culture, shaped by cinematic portrayals and romanticized stories, has softened Wallace's last moments into something almost heroic, a swift death for a courageous figure. Yet the truth was far darker and unimaginably savage. King Edward I, known as Longshanks, had devised Wallace's punishment not just as vengeance but as a powerful message meant to reverberate through the ages. This death was crafted to be so gruesome, so public, and so thoroughly recorded that it would warn anyone who might dare to oppose English rule. The chosen sentence was hanging, drawing, and quartering, an extreme penalty reserved exclusively for traitors, representing the peak of legal cruelty in medieval England. This was not merely about ending a life. It was about the total annihilation of human dignity, the complete destruction of hope, and the creation of a spectacle so horrifying that it would linger in the collective memory of Scotland for countless generations. Today we remove the layers of legend to reveal the harsh truth of William Wallace's last moments. To fully grasp the terror of Wallace's execution, we first need to understand the environment that shaped it. Medieval Scotland in the late 13th and early 14th centuries was a land torn between freedom and domination, where the idea of a nation was still evolving and loyalty was often driven by necessity rather than emotion. The Scottish Wars of Independence had erupted after a crisis of succession, and Edward I seized the chance to impose English rule directly. He saw the Northern Kingdom not as an independent land, but as a rebellious territory needing control. William Wallace rose amid this turmoil, not as a nobleman thirsting for power, but as a humble landowner fueled by personal grief and patriotic anger. His family had endured suffering under English rule, and when he took up arms at Stirling Bridge in the year 1297, he did so with the rage of a man who had lost everything and the hope of a man who envisioned a free Scotland. His triumph was more than a military success. It was a powerful symbol that English cavalry could be overcome and that Scottish independence was achievable. Edward I, known for his brutal crackdown on Welsh resistance, was not a ruler who allowed rebellion to go unpunished. The expulsion of Jews from England lasted a long time. Shanks realized that rebellion was similar to a fire because it could spread rapidly if it was not completely put out. Wallace's victory needed to be not only undone, but also turned into a warning tale. The English king had to prove that opposing his power would bring consequences so harsh that future generations would think twice before even considering defiance. The political atmosphere in 1305 was key to understanding Wallace's outcome. By that moment, most Scottish nobles had accepted Edward's dominion, seeing compromise as better than destruction. Wallace's ongoing opposition made him more than just an adversary to England. He became a source of shame for the Scottish elite who had chosen to yield. His capture became a top priority for reasons beyond military concerns. It was a political necessity, His very presence questioned the validity of Scotland's surrender. The search for William Wallace continued for several years, involving a large network of spies, informers, and traitors. Edward II put a large reward on Wallace's capture, while the English government in Scotland worked methodically to cut him off from any allies. The trap gradually closed as former friends abandoned him, driven by fear, greed, or simply a wish to survive in a world where being connected to Wallace meant certain death. The betrayal came, as it often does in such tales, from inside. This happened in August 1305. William was likely captured near Glasgow due to the betrayal of Sir John Mant, a Scottish knight who had sworn loyalty to English rule. The precise details remain a topic of debate among historians, but the result was undeniable. The man who had become the emblem of Scottish defiance was now under English control. His capture sparked celebrations in London, hailed as a major triumph. However, for Edward IV, this was merely the start of the humiliation he planned for William. The journey from Scotland to London served as its own form of torment, aimed at shattering William's resolve before facing his final sentence. Bound and guarded, he was paraded through various English towns where crowds gathered to witness the notorious Scottish rebel. This was psychological warfare executed with careful intent, turning a hero into a public spectacle, a leader into something strange and exposed. By the time William arrived in London, he had already suffered weeks of degradation, yet his trial was only beginning. The trial of William was a sham, a legal charade that fulfilled a crucial propaganda role for the English crown. Held on the 23rd of August in the year 1305 at Westminster Hall, the proceedings were carried out in Latin, a language William probably did not comprehend. He faced charges of treason, murder, sacrilege, arson, and various other offenses against the English crown. The irony did not escape those at the time. William was accused of betraying a king he had never recognized as his rightful ruler. When confronted with these accusations, the injustice was clear. William was given the chance to speak, and reportedly declared he could not be guilty of treason against Edward I because he had never been Edward's subject. This bold reply sealed his fate, although in reality the verdict had already been decided. The trial was merely a spectacle, intended to cloak a foregone conclusion with the appearance of legality. All judges had been appointed by Edward I and had no plans to show leniency to the man who had become the icon of Scottish defiance. The accusations brought against William were carefully constructed to justify the harshness of his sentence. Treason was the gravest crime, punishable by the full terror of hanging, drawing, and quartering. Additional charges of murder and sacrilege relating to his attacks on English soldiers and priests aimed to depict him as a criminal rather than a noble fighter. The English legal system had been turned into a tool of state intimidation, with William set to be its most prominent casualty. The sentence was delivered with solemn ceremony. William was to be dragged through the streets of London, hanged by the neck but cut down before death, disemboweled alive, beheaded, and finally his body divided into 4 parts. Every part of the punishment carried deep symbolic significance. The dragging represented disgrace, the hanging the rejection by divine grace, the disembowelment spiritual corruption, and the quartering the total annihilation of his being. This was no ordinary execution but a calculated display of terror. The morning of August 23rd, 1305 broke clear and warm over London. The city had been readying itself for this event for several days. with platforms erected and crowds assembling from all over England to watch the death of the Scottish insurgent. The authorities had transformed Wallace's execution into a public occasion, complete with vendors offering food and drinks to the gathered multitude. This was not merely about justice, but also served as entertainment, a stark demonstration of the English crown's authority, and a warning of the consequences awaiting anyone who dared oppose it. Wallace was first undressed and tied to a hurdle, a wooden frame designed to be dragged through the streets of London. The route was precisely planned to increase both the humiliation and the spectacle. Starting from the Tower of London, where he had been imprisoned, the procession moved through the busiest parts of the city to ensure that the largest possible audience witnessed his degradation. The cobbled streets tore at his flesh as he was hauled behind horses, leaving a trail of blood marking his last journey. The crowds lining the streets were composed of a mix of curious onlookers, English loyalists, and those who simply enjoyed watching others suffer. Medieval executions were public occasions, doubling as entertainment and as powerful reminders of royal authority. The spectators jeered and hurled refuse at Wallace as he passed, their conduct encouraged by the authorities who wanted to make certain that his final moments were as harrowing as possible. This was a form of state-approved cruelty carried out on an enormous scale, designed to humiliate to the utmost degree. The procession advanced slowly, allowing ample time for the crowds to assemble and for Wallace's agony to be extended. Eyewitnesses of the period recall him remaining conscious throughout this torment, his gaze fixed on some faraway point as though perceiving something beyond the immediate horror of his predicament. Whether this reflected defiance, acceptance, or mere shock remains a mystery. Yet witnesses emphasized that he never cried out or pleaded for mercy, a detail that later became a crucial part of his legend. At Smithfield, London's customary execution site, a scaffold had been built specifically for Wallace's death. The audience here was even more numerous and lively than along the route, with merchants selling pies and ale to those who had secured the prime viewing spots many hours earlier. The festive and noisy atmosphere was intentional. English authorities sought to frame Wallace's execution not as a martyr's sacrifice, but rather as a spectacle celebrating English law and dominance. The executioner, a professional likely experienced in numerous such acts, began his task with practiced precision. Wallace was first hanged by the neck, but the rope was placed in such a way to cause strangulation instead of a swift death through neck-breaking. The crowd observed as he fought for air, his face turning a deep purple, and his body convulsing in the universal silent agony of death by suffocation. Yet just as his strength began to wane, he was still alive, fully aware of everything happening to him. What followed became the most dreadful part of the entire ordeal. While William remained conscious, the executioner started the gruesome task of removing his organs. With a sharp blade, he sliced open the abdomen and carefully pulled out each internal organ one after another. Eyewitnesses recorded that the victim's screams were unlike anything they had ever encountered, a sound echoing the deepest agony of human experience. The executioner displayed every organ to the crowd before casting it into a fire prepared specifically for this purpose. The burning of William's entrails was a deliberate act steeped in medieval symbolism. In that era, the bowels were believed to be the seat of emotion and compassion. By burning them, as William observed, the executioner symbolically eradicated his humanity, reducing him in the eyes of onlookers to something less than human. The stench of burning flesh and organs filled the air, intensifying the horror of the nightmare unfolding before everyone. Throughout this horrific process, William stayed conscious with his eyes open, fully aware, even as his body was mercilessly destroyed. Some reports indicate he even continued to speak, though what he uttered has been lost to time. The executioner's expertise lay not only in inflicting extreme pain, but also in prolonging William's agony. Death was intended as a final release, not the end of his suffering. At last, the executioner acted without delay. To finish his gruesome task, William's head was cut off with a single clean strike of the sharp axe, finally ending his agony. However, even in death, the disgrace persisted as the severed head was lifted for the crowd to witness, blood still oozing from the wounded neck before being placed aside for future exhibition. The body was then divided into 4 parts, each piece displayed to the onlookers resembling cuts of meat in a butcher's shop. The handling of William's remains was as deliberate and calculated as the execution itself. William's head was soaked in tar to preserve it, and then positioned on a spike atop London Bridge, where it stayed for many years, serving as a harsh warning to anyone daring to oppose English rule. The 4 quarters of his corpse were dispatched to various Scottish towns, including Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth. These parts were publicly exhibited, reminding people of the dreadful fate awaiting rebels. This scattering of William's body was not mere cruelty, but a strategic political statement. Each fragment sent a strong message to the local communities, acting as a tangible symbol of English dominance and the severe consequences of defiance. The English recognized that symbols had power comparable to armies, and William's dismembered remains became a representation of their control over Scotland. The immediate result of this brutal execution was precisely as Edward I had intended. The savage display accomplished its goal, with Scottish opposition appearing to weaken and falter under the weight of such a merciless reminder. The sight of such an overwhelming display of English authority caused many supporters of Wallace to either escape the country or accept English control. Believing that no cause was worth enduring such a terrible death, the execution effectively turned a symbol of defiance into a deterrent against rebellion. However, Edward I misjudged the Scottish reaction to Wallace's martyrdom. Instead of quashing the resistance, the cruel nature of Wallace's death only intensified it. The sheer horror of his execution became a powerful call to arms for those unwilling to submit to English rule. Robert the Bruce, who would later ascend the Scottish throne, was reportedly inspired to act by witnessing the scene of Wallace's demise. He saw in it the true face of English governance. The way Wallace died also shaped the future tactics of Scottish fighters. The message was unmistakable. Being captured by the English brought unimaginable torture and disgrace. This understanding fueled a more desperate and resolute form of combat, where Scots preferred to die in battle rather than surrender. Wallace's execution fostered a mentality of no mercy, where neither kindness nor leniency was expected or granted. The political effects reached far beyond Scotland's borders. Other European nations observed Wallace's execution with a mix of fascination and horror. They recognized it as a stark example of English cruelty, a method that could be employed against them as well. The severity of the execution left a lasting impression on the continent, showing the extreme lengths the English would go to maintain their dominance. Wallace became a key part of England's image, contributing to a sense of isolation that would later create challenges for English foreign relations. Edward I's display of power was clearly communicated, but so was the message of harshness. The historical records of Wallace's execution are abundant, sourced from numerous contemporary accounts that offer a remarkably thorough description of the event. The Llanos Chronicle, compiled by English monks, details the execution with a clinical precision, noting the crowd's reactions and the prolonged suffering Wallace endured. Although these accounts carry an English bias, they provide important insights into medieval views on justice and punishment. Scottish sources, though fewer, present an alternative narrative of the execution. The Chronicle of John of Ferrun depicts Wallace as a heroic figure who met his death with dignity and bravery, highlighting his refusal to plead for mercy or abandon his cause. While these stories may be somewhat idealized, they reflect the profound effect Wallace's death had on Scottish identity, turning a military loss into a moral triumph. The legal documentation surrounding Wallace's trial and execution offers perhaps the most impartial record of the proceedings. Preserved within English National Archives, these documents reveal the meticulous preparation involved in both the trial and the execution. Every aspect was recorded, from the accusations against Wallace to the management of his remains. The English authorities appeared fully aware of the historical importance of their actions. Eyewitness testimonies from both English and Scottish onlookers add further depth to the account of the execution. Some depict the crowd as wildly eager for blood, while others highlight the calm and dignity that William Wallace maintained as he faced his fate. These differing viewpoints underscore the multifaceted nature of the event and its varied significance for distinct groups. The impact of William Wallace's execution extends well beyond the immediate political aftermath of his demise. Over the following centuries, his narrative evolved into a core legend of Scottish nationalism, motivating countless Scots to oppose foreign rule. The sheer cruelty of his death transformed him from a defeated insurgent into an enduring emblem of sacrifice and defiance. This symbolism grew stronger after his passing than it had been during his lifetime. Furthermore, the execution had repercussions for the advancement of international law and human rights theory. Later jurists cited Wallace's harsh treatment as an example of judicial cruelty, breaching essential standards of human respect. The idea that even enemies within the state deserved basic humane treatment began gaining traction partly in response to such extremes. The cultural resonance of Wallace's passing is evident in the various artistic expressions it inspired over the years. From medieval songs to contemporary cinema, his tale has been retold through multiple mediums, reflecting the lasting power of his legacy. The story has been passed down through countless generations, each time uncovering new significance in his sacrifice. The scene of the execution in particular turned into a powerful emblem of the clash between oppression and liberty, despotism, and fairness. The psychological effect on the Scottish people was deep and enduring. William's execution inflicted a collective trauma that wove itself into Scottish cultural identity, forming a shared remembrance of suffering which united the nation in ways that military triumph alone could not accomplish. The horror of his death transformed into a source of resilience, demonstrating that certain principles were worth enduring pain for, and dignity could be upheld even amidst the utmost humiliation. The method used for William's execution, hanging, drawing, and quartering, was more than just a punishment. It conveyed a message about the medieval legal system and the dynamics between ruler and subject. This brutal form of execution was reserved for traitors, individuals who had broken the sacred trust between monarch and subject. By applying this to William, Edward the Fine was clearly stating that every inhabitant of the British Isles was his subject, whether they accepted it or not. The public nature of the execution was equally important. Medieval justice functioned as a spectacle meant to strengthen social ranks and political power through dramatic performances. William's execution became perhaps the most intricate such display of its time, involving not only the physical dismantling of the victim, but also the psychological assault on those witnessing it. The audience was not simply observing justice being carried out, but actively taking part in a ceremony that displayed the authority of the state. The meticulous recording of the execution demonstrates that the English officials were aware they were creating a moment of historic significance. Every aspect was carefully noted, from the beginning of the parade to the treatment of the remains, showing that this event was meant to remain in collective memory. The execution went beyond punishment for Wallace. It was about crafting a story designed to advance English interests for many generations ahead. It is important not to ignore the international implications of the execution. During the medieval period, Europe was closely connected, with information spreading rapidly and reputations holding great importance. William Wallace's death was witnessed by representatives from other countries and reported throughout the continent. This contributed to England's image as a nation ready to employ severe tactics to uphold its authority. Such a reputation would leave a lasting impact on diplomatic relations for many years. When we consider the brutality of William Wallace's death, we face difficult truths about humanity and the wielding of power. The spectators who gathered to witness his suffering were not cruel beings by nature, but ordinary individuals, conditioned to accept and sometimes even take pleasure in the methodical destruction of a fellow human. Their excitement at the event exposes the potential for inhumanity within civilized society when such behavior receives official endorsement. Approving the execution also reveals how swiftly the extraordinary can turn into the ordinary. The executioner who tore apart Wallace was a professional expert in the craft of extending agony. Those officials who arranged the event were bureaucrats adhering to set protocols for handling traitors. The acceptance of extreme brutality is possibly even more unsettling than the cruelty itself, implying that civilization is more delicate than we might imagine. The change of Wallace from insurgent to martyr highlights the unpredictable character of political symbolism. Edward the Found intended the execution to show the uselessness of rebellion, but instead it forged a strong emblem of the honor in sacrificing for one's beliefs. The very excessiveness of the execution contributed to its failure as a warning. The horror was so absolute that it rose to the level of the sublime, going beyond its initial aim to represent something greater. The lasting fascination with Wallace's tale reflects our desire for champions who represent our highest values, especially when facing extreme suffering. His execution reminds us that the greatest triumphs may be moral rather than military, that dignity can persist even when all else is taken away, and that the human spirit can prevail even at the moment the body is destroyed. The story of William Wallace's execution is ultimately a narrative about the cost of standing firm in one's principles. Freedom and the price of standing up for one's beliefs in our comfortable modern society is often overlooked. It is easy to forget that the rights we enjoy today were paid for with the suffering and sacrifices of those who lived long ago. William's brutal death acts as a powerful reminder that liberty is not something achieved without cost, and that those who benefit from it bear a duty to remember and respect the sacrifices made by the fallen. As we encounter our own struggles to protect freedom and human dignity, William's experience remains deeply significant. Although the tactics have evolved, the core conflict between tyranny and freedom persists. His execution tells us that certain values are worth enduring pain for, and that some causes justify the ultimate sacrifice. Every generation faces the decision to balance liberty with security on its own terms. The blood-stained streets of medieval London still resonate with the truth that some ideals demand any price, and that the human spirit, even when severely tested, can motivate others to continue the fight well into the night.